up in people's minds, feel free to get it in the chat, and we'll pick stuff up as we go along.
Okay.
Thanks, Euan.
Thank you very much, Ryan. So as Ryan says, I am an alumni of Heriot Watt. I did the Urban and Regional Planning postgraduate course in 2004 to 6. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Before that, I studied architectural history at Edinburgh University, and I suppose with that hat on, if I'm talking about 20-minute neighbourhoods being an old idea, I could talk probably at length about the historic towns and villages in Scotland, all being 20-minute neighbourhoods, whether or not they're settlements that arose as markets or at cross points or on the coast where they were designed settlements for the fishing industry. These were all 20-minute neighbourhoods, but I'm not going to talk about ideas as old as that today. And as Ryan said, I'm now at SURF, Scottish Regeneration Forum. We've dropped the urban, but kept it in the acronym because it means you can pronounce it. And the forum is a network organisation of over 300 members, both individuals and organisations, who are all focused on learning good practice in the regeneration field. And that's regeneration of housing through skills and culture, employability. And we run the SURF Awards are quite well known. They run in November, where we look at the best examples of recent development in Scotland of regenerated communities. And our focus is obviously on areas that are experiencing deprivation. And I suppose my interest is how we make sure that public policy channels money to the areas that most need it, not to the loudest voices, which is often a challenge. And it's a political challenge, because obviously politicians have to go where they are moved by voters. But that is SURF's focus. We also have 2 members of staff who work in areas directly with regeneration in Dunoon and Langham. And I arrived in SURF in May of this year. And as part of our programme in our funding agreement with the government, we were asked to host a 20-minute neighbourhood practitioner network. And so this was new to SURF, and in some ways new to me, although not really, because it's obviously been on the go for a few years. And I thought what I would like to talk to you today about is the fact that it's a sort of new policy, but in a Scottish policy context, it's maybe an old idea. And so...
Excuse me, Ian, I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
I just put a message in the chat and just need to let everybody know that we're recording this meeting, just to make sure everybody's okay with that. If not, please let us know. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa.
Bye.
So if you're really fascinated by what I say today, you can watch it again. I don't know who would watch a policy seminar twice. But I thought we would go back to 2002 and SPP1. So this is basically to look at context of what planning policy has said. I think I'm saying this on the basis that we all have a bit of an idea of what 20-minute neighbourhood is around livable places, but I'm not going to go into detail about it because we'll come to that. But back in 2002, when we were still the Scottish Executive, and it wasn't Scottish Government, these were the range of policies that were in SPP1. So they were policies that were looking at moving around by foot as well as by car. They were looking at siting things well. They were looking at taking in the needs of communities. And they were looking at making sure that our environments were maintained, that they were pleasant, they were good quality, and that everything around development was to encourage what we would now term active travel, which at this point isn't being used as a term. But it also includes making sure that local facilities are also accessible by choice of transport modes. And there's a focus on mixed use, mixed tenure, and also good local service provision. So these are some of the things that have been in the mix since 2002 that I would say, you can see a 20-minute neighbourhood being kind of described loosely within that. So these are the policies that were set at a Scottish and national level that local development plans should be following, and the planning system should be seeking to deliver these outcomes in the areas that they had governance of. I'm going to leap forward to 2010. Actually, have I missed a slide? No, I've not. 2010, next iteration of Scottish planning policy. So we are now the Scottish Government, which reflects a change in the political nature of the makeup of the Scottish Government. And again, this is the policies in that which I've drawn out. So this is not a comprehensive list of policies that you find in Scottish planning policy, but again, it's a range of policies which we're looking at place-based development and how we travel around them, mixed communities it describes them as, active travel becomes a buzzword, sustainable locations, particularly in relation to access, is being promoted in this, and that there's an accessibility of homes, services, open space, and employment opportunities by a range of transport options. And I suppose, again, I would say very loosely, you can begin seeing something here that, to me, begins to look like a 20-minute neighbourhood, that you're saying something where people can live, they can find employment, they can be educated, there's open space, there are health provisions there, and that the quality of those things is also addressed, but I would say maybe addressed slightly directly in this range of policy options. And 2010 was also the beginning of what I would refer to as the age of the charrette. It's when Andres Duaney came over from America, and there were a range of charrettes run. Loch Gelly was one of the most famous ones as a settlement in Fife, asking people how they wanted their community to develop. By chance, I couldn't remember the date of the Loch Gelly charrette, and the first thing came up was, how much did this cost? It was £40,000 apparently. This was one of the first things that Google revealed. But charrettes became a buzzword in that period of how we began looking at developing communities within the context of the planning system, but the charrettes began looking at more than just the planning system. Shortly after that, you had creating places, which essentially repeated, actually I have missed a slide. I was thinking yes, we missed my very first slide. The very first slide is from 2001, which identified the qualities of successful places, which are about identity, that they're safe and pleasant. So it's like looking at quality, that you can move around them on foot. People are welcome in them, and that they're sustainable. And Heriot gives us quite a broad description of sustainability. Again, sustainability at that point in time was being well used within the planning environment. And I suppose I've gone back to 2001 partly because that's when I didn't go to university until I was 30, and it was around this time that I began looking at policy documents. So this is, and I remember this coming out, and this being seen as a good positive thing. It was a policy statement, which maybe had a lighter touch in terms of how it would be applied through the planning system. But again, within that, those principles there, those 5 principles that are identified there, you could say, are they a 20-minute neighbourhood as we're beginning to understand what a 20-minute neighbourhood is? Yes. If I skip back to 2013, in 2013, Creating Places came out, which was a policy statement of architecture and place. This was in some ways a sort of slicked up version of the Designing Places document from 2001. It had nicer pictures, it had more recent developments that had taken place in Scotland, but fundamentally identified very similarly the 6 qualities that you're looking for in a successful place. The 6th quality that is identified in a successful place, I would say, is beauty. It's not too well defined in the first one. I think in the first iteration of Designing Places, there was an understanding that the designers in Scotland were well qualified enough to be able to deliver beauty without too much direction. Creating Places, 11 years, 12 years later, maybe reflected that not all designers are great at producing beautiful places, and began giving a bit more of a steer as to what sort of things designers should be thinking about. And there was in between times, there was a whole range of planning advice notes, which gave more detailed guidance on housing design, street design, things like that. And in 2013, we also had the Town Centres Review, commonly called the Fraser Report, because Malcolm Fraser chaired the group that produced this. And fundamentally, the principle that arose from that was the Town Centre First principle, which was recognising that we'd had quite a long period of time when town centres were not the focus of development, that edge of town or out of town development was becoming the main threat. And it had been the main threat for some time to the development within town centres. And obviously by 2013, patterns of shopping, the rise of Amazon, you're beginning to see that. And that group was really looking at how we make our town centres maintain their activity and maintain investment going into those town centres. Around the same time, so between 2012 and 2015, we saw the development and then the publishing in 2015 of the place standard. And the place standard was created as a discussion tool. I have to confess, I remember when this came out, and I remember for an organisation I worked for at the time, someone coming to present it to us, and maybe I confess I felt unimpressed by it at the time. My attitude towards it has changed since then. I think I was unimpressed at the time because I think it maybe wasn't presented fully as a tool for discussion. It was maybe being talked about as maybe a tool, a measurement tool. But the idea was that the place standard could be taken to a community of place, and with the various headings around the wheel, many of you will be familiar with this, but if you're a new student to Scotland, you may not have seen this. That you would then rate your place, your perception of the place, between a value of 1 and 7, which ends up with this spider diagram. But to me, the real value of it becomes as a discussion tool within a community when you begin talking about it with your neighbours that live in the area to understand how everyone feels about the place, and you begin seeing where there are certain things that are lacking in the place which you live. But you can see it covers a whole range of topics: care and maintenance, sense of control, your safety, the ability to socially interact, what your natural space looks like, play facilities. So it's a broad range of things. And I would say it's beginning to be quite holistic in its approach to place. Some of the earlier documents that you look at, very often they're written through a prism of a professional perspective. So sometimes around architecture or urban design, and sometimes that can fall down the hole of aesthetics, beauty being one of those, which I'm all for beauty. I think it's a very subjective matter. I'm a big fan of brutalism. But sometimes those agendas can begin to crowd out more fundamental issues about how people experience place and what they value about the place and the utility of the place in which they are living. And the place standard, I would say, on reflection, really did begin doing that and was a tool for lay people, for non-professional people, people who aren't urbanists, who haven't studied planning or architecture, to be able to talk about the place, and for the language to begin to be a language to be used that was maybe not the language that planners use, but was a language that the public would use. And the place standard has gone on to be used, it's been promoted very heavily by, not just by the government, but by Public Health Scotland. So the health side of Scotland and maybe were involved in the development of this. It's been used in the development of local development plans. I think, from memory, Lomond and the Trossachs and in Dundee are two local authorities which used it for communities to begin identifying what they liked or what they wanted to change about the places in which they live. But it begins to have quite a coherent range of agendas that you would say are important about a livable place. Then in 2019, the government, along with COSLA and with the support of organisations like SURF, published the place principle. Now, I don't like reading things out from an overhead, but I am going to read this one out. Places where people, location and resources combine to create a sense of identity and purpose, and is at the heart of addressing the needs and realising the full potential of communities. Places are shaped by the way resources, services and assets are directed and used by the people who live in and invest in them. A more joined up, collaborative and participative approach to services, land and buildings across all sectors within a place enables better outcomes for everyone and increased opportunities for people and communities to shape their own lives. Now, the reason I'm reading that out is because this was debated in Parliament about 2 years ago. And when it was debated in Parliament, it was really interesting because parliamentarians aren't planning professionals. There was a high amount of humour around this. And they recognised that this was quite opaque. They found it difficult to understand what this really was. They knew it was important, but I would say as members of the public, they obviously found it quite impenetrable. Now, if you work in planning or regeneration, you may not find this impenetrable, But I found their response to this really, really interesting. And I'm sure we could probably find the recording of it on the parliamentary website, and you can watch it again. But it was just fascinating to see the fact that they knew the importance of it, but they probably weren't really fully getting it. And I think that's why it becomes interesting that the 20-minute neighbourhood starts appearing in policy, government policy. So in the programme for government for last year is the first place I think that the 20-minute neighbourhood is mentioned actually in a government document as a policy agenda. And you can see that they give a definition there of where people can meet their needs within a 20-minute walk from their house, enabling people to live better, healthier lives and supporting our net zero ambitions. So it's about helping us, people who live here, have good lives, healthy lives, as we meet what is a global agenda as we move to a net zero society. But it also acknowledges that this is something that has been developed in Melbourne, Portland and Paris. The Parisian model is the one that probably seems to have caught most media attention, partly because Carlos Moreno advised Anne Hidalgo, the mayor in Paris, and it became a big policy agenda for her in her run for election in 2020. And he described it as the 15-minute city. And this morning I gave a talk to the Midlothian Voluntary Action, and I had a Parisian picture with a big cross through it. Mainly because one of my fears around a focus on the Parisian model is that it conjures up images of us picking up a coffee and having a baguette under our arm and a beautiful Instagrammable scene, which my worry is that kind of makes it quite superficial. If you look at Carlos Moreno's work and what he says about it, it's not superficial, what he's saying, but to me there's all the pictures that are associated with the 15-minute city in Paris are basically inside the periphery, and they're central Paris, and well, they are lovely, but they don't maybe represent Paris beyond the periphery, where it will be harder to deliver 15-minute neighbourhoods, but they are doing it, and they're primarily doing it by extending the metro network within Paris. But there is a high acknowledgement that Paris has work to do on that. So that was this year. That was last year that it appeared in the programme for government. And then this year, it appeared in the programme for government again. And it didn't offer another definition to what we had before, but it brings in the phrase live well locally, which is, I think, actually another good phrase to think about in terms of the 20-minute neighbourhood. And it also talks about the fact that it will be in National Planning Framework 4, which will define 20-minute neighbourhoods. So that's Fiona Simpson, the new Chief Planner's job, will be to define 20-minute neighbourhoods. And for those of us who work around the planning system, we all knew that the 20-minute neighbourhood would be in NPF 4, so it was good to have confirmation that it will be in NPF 4, but we're all waiting to see exactly what that looks like. Because we have no more detailed definition beyond the one that I gave from last year. But it's clearly got a strong agenda because it's going to support public health and well-being, it's going to reduce inequality, and it's going to strengthen community resilience in the face of climate change. So it's an important agenda, and it's been talked about a lot. And as we host the 20-minute neighbourhood practitioner network, we're hosting that to kind of find out, what do people think it is? What do they think it looks like where they live? What are the questions that they have around it? And I suppose some of the interesting things coming out of it are the biggest bit of research on 20-minute neighbourhoods in Scotland come from Ramble. You'll find this online. There's a link at the end of this which links to my website and has a whole bunch of other links to the things that I'm referring to, which identifies that Scotland, in an asset-based way, does have the possibility of delivering 20-minute neighbourhoods in an urban setting. The point it does make, and if I flick back to the last screen, the eagle eyes among you will notice that it says Melbourne, Portland and Paris. They're all cities. Scotland is a country. Scotland is the first place to be saying that this is a policy agenda to be rolled out nationwide. And this is the model that I would say we are looking most closely at in Scotland, is the Melbourne model. So rather than looking at what Paris is doing or Portland, this is the one that this figure is the one that you see most in terms of Scottish discussions around 20-minute neighbourhoods, and what you're seeking to find within a 20-minute neighbourhood. Now, some of the interesting things that have arisen in discussion around the 20-minute neighbourhood in our practitioner network and in the people that I'm talking to about it is we asked people before we had about 150 people join our practitioner network. We've asked them how they would define a 20-minute neighbourhood. Men are obsessed with the number 20. They want to know, is it 10 minutes out and 10 minutes back? Who is it 10 minutes out and 10 minutes back for? Is it people of every ability, physical ability, of every age group? There's quite a focus on that 20-minute. Neighbourhood people understand, but the 20-minute is one that there was a lot of questions. There's a lot of focus on. The women who responded to our questions around how they identified it, they took a much broader definition of 20. And also, if you're not in urban Scotland, if you're in rural or semi-rural Scotland, you also have a more relaxed attitude toward that 20-minute, which you would have to have, because delivering every public service within 10 minutes of everyone's front door across the whole of Scotland would be financially and physically impossible. I'm not saying that because I want to undermine the concept of living well locally, but I think the focus should be on living well locally, as the Scottish Government's programme for government also used that term, and Dermot Lawler used it in an event we had last week as well. Because if we focus very much on timing everything, or measuring it to 800 metres as the standard distance, or just under half a mile if you've already gone back to imperial, then we will face problems in improving access within neighbourhoods. But you can see from that diagram that there's a whole range of things that they're saying that you would need in a daily sense for a 20-minute neighbourhood. And some of these things are about physical assets that you have, and some of them are about quality within those things. And one of the things that I think is always important to acknowledge, and sometimes isn't acknowledged, is affordability being a really important element of that. So affordable housing and affordable food is one that's incredibly important to having a little neighbourhood, so that you have a mixed neighbourhood, as some of our older policy agendas recognise were important. Another aspect that's probably not in this, but that we have now all become a lot more aware of, is digital connectivity as being an important part of a 20-minute neighbourhood, in that not everyone will have good digital connectivity. I live in a tenement. One of my neighbours doesn't have a smartphone, doesn't have internet in her house. She comes up to my house twice a week to use my intranet to check her emails, because previously she was using the local library. And it's looking at things like local libraries being hubs of connectivity to other things. Some of us may have had consultations with a doctor online in this period. We may go on having some medical consultations online, which would be, it's important to have connectivity to nearby if you don't physically have it within your home, which may lead to another form of connectivity when you go and visit a hospital for a specialist reason. There are times in our lives when we do need specialist services on a daily basis, when we have particular illnesses, but we know that we're probably not going to get those services within 10 minutes of everyone's front door. But we should have a well-connected public transport within 10 minutes of our front door that will take us to that facility that we need for that point in life. So the connectivity is an incredibly important part of this, both for walking, cycling and public transport. And the Ramboll research that I referred to was commissioned by Transport Scotland, which again, I think would say a lot about recognising where investment is going to have to go. And I would say it's maybe a bit of a disappointment within the programme for government that while public bus services are acknowledged within the programme for government in this term, it's around fares, not really examining how accessible our public bus transport is across Scotland. We can reopen up some rail lines, but buses for non-urban Scotland are really the lifeblood that are going to make a difference to whether or not somewhere is close to a 20-minute neighbourhood or not. But looking at those range of features that you see within it, and the interesting thing about seeing this is if you come from a specialist area, though you'll probably be looking for something that isn't there. And in my heritage background, basically all my heritage colleagues, if they couldn't see the word heritage or conservation in it, we'd be saying, why is that not there? Even though it's probably implicit within one of the titles there, or an acknowledgement that heritage forms a background to all of this and isn't mentioned in it as a result, because it's always there. But if you look at this diagram and compare it back to this diagram, then I would say, which is the place standard, we're looking at something very, very similar. That we're taking the place standard, which is there for community discussion, for people to think about place and their experience of place, and actually 20-minute neighbourhoods are the snappy zeitgeist word for what the place standard and the place principle are trying to drive us toward. Now, I would say the bigger question that lies maybe behind all this is, I've gone back to 2001, and you could say the policies that are in there, there is a question as to why we don't have that consistently delivered across all of Scotland. So there's been an aspiration for walkable, cyclable, good network, well-placed facilities in all settlements across Scotland for 20 years. But while we can look at good examples, and the surf nominees, the Surf Awards will be full of good examples of this, and we can all look at awards that do give the good examples of where something has been well done, where we have reused things, but it's not consistent. And we can probably still look at developments that are taking place that are not meeting those aspirations of mixed tenure, walkable neighbourhoods. And the answer to why that hasn't happened is often debated. I would say it's down to the discretionary nature of our planning system in the UK, in that it's open. My glib way of describing our planning system is, to developers, it says, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, which if you're Scottish might be a recognisable phrase to you. And that, try and do something in a place that the planning system doesn't really like, but if it delivers housing, we want as many houses as possible for understandable reasons. You'll get it, even though it's maybe not well connected, and it has the local facilities, and it's building on natural space or an agricultural land, because it's meeting one agenda. So there's maybe an issue within that, but there are also much wider issues around austerity cuts, the rationalisation of the services in health services. Currently, I suppose we see a potential rationalisation around public services in one of our cities in Glasgow, and libraries not reopening. I've already mentioned libraries as a potential very important community resource within a place. So these are all things that play into the reason why we maybe don't always have good 20-minute neighbourhoods, either in new places or when we're making decisions in the existing places, which is why the issue around 20-minute neighbourhoods is not necessarily a planning issue. It's going to be an NPF4, but it's not really a planning issue. It's much wider than a planning issue, because many of the things that drive whether or not something is a 20-minute neighbourhood, the siting of schools, for instance, or of new health facilities, aren't decided by the planning system saying we think it should go there. It's maybe decided by the health service thinking, well, we have this amount of money and there is a vacant site over there, which is easy for us to use. And in the short term, cheaper for us to use than reusing a brownfield site or reusing one of our own sites that may not result in the optimum health facilities, but maybe that compromise would also reduce the need for driving or for using public transport. It may be in a walkable area. So there are other decision-making, the Scottish Futures Trust, which obviously provides investment and funding for a lot of public services and where things, and is involved in deciding where things are, have also made decisions which in retrospect we would think rebuilding high schools on the edge of towns, is that the best thing to have done? It has a knock-on impact on the local economy of the settlement, all the shops that, well, teenagers go to, mainly chip shops or Greggs. It has an effect on the local economy of those places as well. So there's things much wider than the planning system, which offers some sort of direction, vision, but often offers control over change that actually happens. But there's change that can happen that it doesn't have a full level of control of, which is why the 20-minute neighbourhood concept has to be used across the whole of government. So Transport Scotland are obviously looking at it. They've commissioned the research on it. But it's not just them. And I suppose there are indications of that make me hopeful about where it sits. And one is in the infrastructure investment plan. And the infrastructure commission in Scotland did quite a bit of work and were quite open in talking to a range of stakeholders across Scotland before they made recommendations to Scotland. And fundamentally, I'd say their recommendations were really quite transformational. What's important to recognise about infrastructure sometimes is thought of as roads, railway, massive pieces of urban kit or non-urban kit and bridges, but they were looking at infrastructure in a much wider sense, and the images on the front of their of the government's response to it reflect the broad nature of how they are viewing infrastructure. So it includes housing, it includes employment, it includes travel. It's fortunately showing a bike, and it's no doubt we might look at that picture of somebody on a laptop and that could have been at work, but actually it's at home, and now we've experienced the home working for some extended period. But within the plan, there is a higher investment hierarchy, and this is quite different to how things used to look at, because infrastructure was building big new things like the Queensferry crossing, which were, it's £1 billion and it's delivered on time and isn't that great. Well, yes, but it turns out the Forth Broad Bridge had a much longer life than we thought anyway. However, we've now got 2 lovely bridges. They're quite spectacular. But what this looks at is, in that hierarchy, the top level one has been slightly changed from the earlier drafts of it, but the earlier drafts said we need to understand what a place needs. What are the demands of the community in that place? And then you work from understanding what the place actually needs and the people in that place need, to using what you already have as much as possible, and you don't build new things or extend or spread out until you have exhausted all other options around what we already have. Although 20-minute neighbourhoods isn't mentioned specifically in this inverted pyramid, it is mentioned in the document as a key government policy that needs to be rolled out, and it needs to be rolled out across government and across decision makers. And the other area that I think is of interest, and I've mentioned the fact that Health Scotland are already involved in the creation of the place standard, but the Improvement Service and Public Health Scotland, with funding from Scottish Government and the Health Foundation, are also working on the 20-minute neighbourhood concept and looking at what Scotland's wellbeing outcomes are and tying it into the National Performance Framework, not the planning framework, but the National Performance Framework, which itself applies to all of the Scottish Government's directorates. So there's something about spreading the 20-minute neighbourhood concept out across all of decision makers. And I think my hope with the 20-minute neighbourhood is to say it's not a new policy, it's an old concept, even in policy terms. We've been talking about this for 20 years, but we've not been delivering it for 20 years. Is it because we're not holding people to account properly? And the 20-minute neighbourhood, because I think it's easily understood by the public if we don't get too fixated on the number 20, we can use it to ask decision makers with every decision that they make about place-based activity or place-based decisions, how does this fit in with a 20-minute neighbourhood? And they should be able to give us a reason. If something doesn't fit in with a 20-minute neighbourhood, there should be a very good reason for it, and they should be able to be really explicit about that. But if it doesn't fit with a 20-minute neighbourhood, it's a reason for saying, no, we won't make that decision. We will make a maybe more complicated decision to reuse something that we already have. But it requires actually a high level of public engagement to understand what those needs are. And the main challenges to this, in asking our practitioner network what the challenges are, it is 50 years of car-centred design, urban design. It is cuts to public sector and a centralisation of services. So the rationalisation or centralisation of services for efficiency measures has meant that people have to travel further for certain things, and that has knock-on effects, which I think the 20-minute neighbourhood policy recognises and is asking us to start undoing that. It won't happen overnight, and it isn't a silver bullet. This is really complicated because settlements are complex and people are complex. And while the Ramboll identified that physically in Scotland, it will be possible to deliver 20-minute neighbourhoods across settlements in Scotland, the quality of those places, it's harder to measure what that's like. So GIS data, I totally love it, but it tells you very specific things, and it doesn't tell you what it's like to live somewhere. It also doesn't tell you the reasons why people don't go certain places. Now, we know that some people won't go to schools because they had a bad experience at school, so they don't want to go to school for other purposes outside of school times, even if it was in their past. There can be tribal reasons people don't cross certain boundaries. And there can be communities of interest that move in certain ways or go in certain directions. And they're minority communities within Scotland, so they will travel more for certain things that they are particularly interested in. And GIS doesn't always pick that up, but also the quality of experience. So yes, there might be a road that takes you 5 minutes to get to your GP, but if it's 8 lanes and it's horrible to walk along, then no, you may not choose to walk along that road because it's polluting and noisy. And it's hard to capture some of that in some of the analysis. So it requires people who are making decisions to really know their place, or work with a community who really know their place, which is where things like the work around talking to the community, using the place standard to create a local place plan so that the community has set out what its agenda is, what it wants the place to look like, where there are areas for improvement, are taken on board by decision-making authorities. But we're not over-asking this of communities. We ask them, we spend some time understanding a place, and then we spend the next few years delivering what's identified in that place. Obviously, with allowing for changes and demands that may occur because of things like COVID that unexpectedly come along. But COVID has also made the 20-minute neighbourhood seem a little bit more real, because we have all lived locally for 18 months. And within that 18 months, we've lived very, very locally for 3-month periods of that. And so things have been achievable. And so that has given more attention to it, which gives me hope that it will continue to be a strong policy agenda. But it needs strong political leadership. We need to give our elected members at a national and local level confidence that they can deliver on this. And that's down to all of us engaging with politicians and engaging them in a positive and constructive way. I said I wouldn't show a picture of a lovely, slick Parisian town. What I'm showing you here is a dialectogram by an artist called Mitch Miller. The places that we have might not be Instagrammable, but are they useful? Do they have the services we need, and can we move around them in a free and pleasant way to meet our friends? Faldmere is a pretend place, but it's the sort of place that represents lots of settlements within Scotland. It is achievable, but there's a lot of work to do. It will be an NPF4 for 10 years, so we have time in which to begin delivering this. I conclude with a link to our Policy Practice Network, which has links to local authorities that are already working this in Edinburgh and Glasgow, as well as other research done by Ramboll and others. I will end my presentation there.
Thanks, Euan. Appreciate that. Yeah, a lot of food for thought in there, and a number of questions that I've noted down here. I take your point actually about the building the assets. Did a lot of work in East Manchester urban regeneration about 15-20 years ago, and very much a build it and they will come mentality. So building new parks, community centres, no lack of physical assets, but actually translating that into everyday use was pretty complex. So all the the parks you went around, they were brand new, all look fantastic, but actually these strong associations of crime, perceptions of crime, memories of being in public spaces that were harder to overcome. So regeneration professionals putting their hands up and saying, well, we've built it, that's that. What more do you want us to do? But actually there's something about translation of that into an asset in people's lives. So whilst it looks like big criticism I have of sort of asset mapping is that an asset for whom only if they can realize that asset, so on paper, sticking these things down on a map looks great, but like you say, what does it look like in terms of the people's experiences? But anyway, just a comment there, not particularly a question in there, but has anybody got any questions? I noticed the chat was quite active running through there, Lee, so I don't know if there's any specific questions, if people want to raise their hands and we'll pick up anything in the chat. Again, I've got a couple here I could get started with, but has anybody got any questions there? Judith?
Hello, hi. Thanks for that, Euan. That was a really interesting presentation. And I was just wondering about how far the link has been made between a 20-minute neighbourhood and improved inequalities and health and well-being. So, you know, there's lots of talk about we are doing this to improve or to reduce inequalities. But I'm just wondering what evidence there is that those kinds of neighbourhoods do that kind of thing.
I would say the evidence for that, I've not seen it published. And the work that the Improvement Service in Public Health Scotland, so Irene Buchanan for the Improvement Service is doing a lot of work on this. And it is around, they're interested is around areas that are experiencing deprivation and improving health inequalities. And all the evidence is around the areas that currently are 20-minute neighbourhoods. They're lovely and people have good health in those areas. So you could say that is the evidence that there's areas, but those tend to be areas of wealth anyway. And so I suppose, you know, in a Scottish context, it's things like Bruntsfield, you know, there's lots of services there, but it's also an area where there's a high proportion of wealth. And what the needs are in places that are experiencing deprivation, there will be different needs there. And so you need to make sure those services are provided there. So I'd say what Public Health Scotland are embarking on, so what I didn't say in the presentation was that they are embarking on 4 projects in Wallistown and Ayr, Dunoon and Argyll, Clydebank, and there is one other place, Wallistown, Ayr, Clydebank, Alloa, thank you very much, where they're specifically looking at how we do that and doing systems change to address health inequalities in those places over the next 3 years. So there is an attempt to begin building up that evidence base.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for the voice that said Alloa.
Who was that? Yeah, cheers.
It was me,
Judith.
Caroline.
Thanks, Judith. David.
Yeah, hello. Very interesting, Euan. But my living has always been earned through commercial property, so in a sense, I'm looking at through that particular lens. But on a slightly bigger note, although picking that up, I mean, there are many benefits of centralisation. I mean, I live in the south side of Glasgow, and our probably half a dozen doctors' surgeries are now combined into one super duper building that's got a pharmacy and it's got other things. So it's no problem for me to visit. I drive there, but it seems to go against this. Shopping is another area where, you know, if you want a butcher, a baker, that's absolutely fine. If you want a John Lewis, you're not going to get one in every one of these. So I'm trying to understand the balance here between what people truly want and what, if you like, they're being told they want.
So I suppose one of the words that I've maybe omitted to use today, and it appears in some of the definition, is daily need. Do you need to go to John Lewis daily, David?
Thankfully, no. Right. I don't go annually, I should emphasize.
So there, it doesn't mean everything needs to be available everywhere all the time. There are certain things that we do, and it's one of the things that, you know, there are people from the heritage sector and from the museum sector as part of the practitioner network, and they obviously think heritage is an important part of our lives. Is having a museum, do we go to museums daily? Well, if you work in the museum sector, yes, you do. But for most people, they don't go to a museum every day. So is it a daily need would be one of the questions we might want to consider, because if we're providing museums for daily need, that's much bigger. Libraries maybe can be because of the multifunctional nature of them. Museums can also be multifunctional as well. So the daily bit is the bit that becomes important to ask. There are benefits of centralisation, you're right, but I suppose the questions we have to be asking are there disbenefits that outweigh some of those benefits? So there are cost benefits, yes, but are there disbenefits to the way the community accesses them, particularly if we're wanting to encourage them to use active travel to get to them? And how you measure that and weigh that, there will be no easy metric to that, because it will be dependent on the actual place itself. And I suppose because we do work in Dunoon. Dunoon is an interesting settlement in that it's a population of about 8,000 people, and it is essentially a 20-minute neighbourhood. It has a high school, it has a secondary. The ferry connection could be a lot better out of it. They're having trouble there just now, but that's a whole Scotland-wide problem. But it is also an important hub for the whole of the Cowal Peninsula. So the rest of the Cowal Peninsula won't get there in 20 minutes, but once it's there, it can get everything within a really short space of time. So it's being able to apply the concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood, reflecting what the needs of that place are and having flex within that.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Lisa.
Yes, we have a question from Cameron Brown in the chat, and I'll just read it out. It's got a few questions within his statement. I have a couple of questions regarding 20-minute neighbourhoods. First, how will 20-minute neighbourhoods work for those in rural areas? Will they have to commute to a community, then have everything encompassed within that neighbourhood? Secondly, how will the key stakeholders make 20-minute neighbourhoods affordable for all, and particularly those in inequality and deprivation? If everything is in one place, will this not be highly desirable and force house prices as demand will outbid supply, leaving those in financial disparity out of the loop? And finally, how will 20-minute neighbourhoods encompass all sectors of the workforce, as it might not be possible to have all of these within a 20-minute radius? I appreciate that home working might not make this possible. So it's sort of three questions.
Yeah, okay, I've got them. So the rural question is, you're right. People who live in rural Scotland will not be living in a 20-minute neighbourhood, but they should have easy access to a 20-minute neighbourhood in their nearest settlement, which is why it's important not to try and apply the 20-minute concept to every single front door across Scotland. If we did that, nothing would happen. It would just be complete stasis, because it would be physically and fiscally impossible to deliver services within 10 minutes or 20 minutes of everybody's front door. So there has to be a recognition that applying the policy in rural Scotland, it's applied differently. And it's not expecting people who live on a hilltop farm to have a doctor or a primary school within 10 or 20 minutes of their front door. Obviously, in the past, maybe we did have more rural schools in Scotland, but we've seen a decline there. But turning that back is not really going to be possible. But it's making it as easy as possible to either get to a rural hub or get to a transport hub that will then take us on public transport to the place that there have the services that we need. And also the notion of living in a rural settlement, maybe you don't want to live within 20 minutes of these services. And I suppose one of the things that the fixation on the number means that some people are thinking about it. To me, it sounds imprisoning, that well, you can only live within 20 minutes. You've got to do everything within 20 minutes of your house, which sounds like a terrible trap, and also would lead undeniably to gentrification, which is why in the slide that I showed from Melbourne, it has workplaces and connections to public transport to workplaces. So yes, it would be good to have workplaces, but not all forms of work are going to be within 10 minutes of our house. If you are a nuclear physicist, you're not going to find work 10 minutes from every house in Scotland. There's only going to be a few places within Scotland that you can find that. And yes, you're going to have to travel to that if you don't live there. So yes, there is a danger of gentrification if we view it in everything has to happen within that very tight 10 or 20 minutes, which is why in Paris it might be controversial, but it's also why in Paris it might be achievable because they live in high density. It may also require us to have more housing and have housing that's higher density. This, in my opinion, would be a good thing because we are continuing to build fairly flabby stuff around the edges of our cities. But that is also changing. And if you look at the way some of the shopping centres are readapting, and actually the recent announcements on the Gyle near you and the Regeneration campus, the Gyle is looking at having housing. I hope that housing is dense because the housing there would be super. It's on a tram link. It's got services nearby. So that would be my response to that. And your last question, the third question, I can't remember what that was, Lisa.
Just let me go back to, he says, finally, how will 20-minute neighbourhoods encompass all sectors of the workforce?
It won't. So there are, so as I said, I think I probably answered that. There are some forms of work that will not always be 10 minutes away. In the same way that there are some jobs we can do from home, there are other jobs we can't do from home. Mm-hmm. And that will be a really difficult one for us to actually begin to understand, because that's a form of inequality. It tends to be lower paid jobs that cannot be done from home. And as we experience people who worked in the service industry or who worked in care facilities, they had to leave the house to go to work and were disproportionately impacted by COVID as a result. So there is an issue there that has to be readily acknowledged, and there has to be a means of compensating that through making sure that the means of transport are of a high quality and that they are deeply affordable, which is why you could say, is this an area where centralisation is necessary so that transport is provided equally across the varied populations of Scotland?
Thank you. If I could follow up with just one more, there's a comment, one of the comments has had a few thumbs up, from Harry Smith. It's a comment, but you might want to comment on it. It says a strict focus on 20 minutes seems to be, could be a bit misleading. My impression is that many of the principles underlying what we now call the 20-minute neighbourhood have precedence in Howard's Garden cities, in the various formulations of the compact city from the 1980s onwards, and more recently in retrofits of suburbia.
I agree, and I didn't go back as far back as Howard, because I can't stop at Howard, because as I said, market towns and fishing villages are 20-minute cities without Ebenezer Howard having even been born. So yes, I think the 20-minute could become a mistake, which is why I guard against people fixating on the time aspect of it. However, for other people to understand the place principle and place-based thinking and decision-making, the 20 minutes is helpful. So you could just say it's a neighbourhood policy, but the 20-minute neighbourhood policy, I think, helps capture some people into the discussion. But I totally agree with Harry that there is a danger of focusing on the 20, but it's there now. And it's got traction. But yes, it is a historic idea, and arguably some of our new towns in Scotland were built around those principles of, Livingston, with all those great paths through Livingston, which some people hated, but actually turns out those paths that separate us from roads are pretty good, and it was a great place to cycle. And my family lived in Livingston, so I spent a lot of time cycling around it, and it was a good place as a livable neighbourhood in my childhood experience.
Thanks, Euan. That's great. I just had a question, if you don't mind me coming in there, Euan. It was about another concept that's 2 or 3 decades old. Is this notion of integrated working and joined up working and cross-sectoral policy delivery and getting transport to talk to housing and all the rest of it. And just speaking to some of the challenges, working in those colleagues that we know working in sort of city councils about bringing these different sectors together. Because you mentioned ageing in place, and a lot of the work we've done around age-friendly cities and communities, which in effect should also be cross-cutting in terms of the different types of sectors. Is the challenges of doing that, and again, we're still talking about this, and it's not a new thing. Is the difficulties of delivering truly integrated working and silos, funding silos, all the rest of it. And how we can deliver an initiative like this in an integrated way. And there are some successful examples of area-based regeneration schemes that have delivered joined up working, and but do you sense that's a challenge going forward? Is this something that we're ready for, or is the infrastructure that policy framework not there? Or
I think so. The practitioners. So from a local authority and public sector practitioner side of things, the feedback we get from them is also they're kind of strung out with a lack of resource to deliver stuff, with a lack of them to be able to make differences on the ground. And the communities some communities are also suffering from exhaustion and an expectation to do that. And from a surf perspective, we're wary around the community will do this. because the local authority is, for many reasons, in retreat. So who will take it? So this service needs to happen, and so the community step into it, but they're volunteers. And how appropriate is that? Actually, it should be paid work. Somebody should be paid to do this. And I suppose in the conversation I had this morning, and in the conversation I suppose at the Development Trust Association Network, they had a conference 2 weeks ago, having paid people doing community work to find out what community needs are so that it gets fed up the way is really important. But it's not highly paid work, and it's also work that doesn't have immediately visible, tangible outcomes. So we have people working in Dunoon and Langham, and you could say Anne sometimes describes herself as a gossip, because all she is doing is making sure information is being shared amongst everybody. But you need somebody whose job is to make sure that everybody knows something. And having that happen at a local authority scale, never mind a government scale, appears to be really challenging. And it comes back to some of the things that the Christie Commission was recommending 10 years ago, which I know which everyone's kind of talking about just now, as not having delivered, because it's difficult and it requires high levels of networking and communication. But our target-driven culture, which planning I know knows all about, sometimes the targets that were set are not good measures of actually what we're doing, makes making time for that sort of thing challenging to do. So I don't think people are still working in silos at national and local government level. But there are all the signs of some improvement, and you could say that things like Housing to 2040, it captured a massive amount of things across a whole bunch of directorates within government, which was good. Also makes you think, well, none of this is achievable because it's just so massive. But that is the things that we have to face, and obviously with the climate crisis, the task in front of us is mammoth. But being able to view how we are making decisions at a local level in the face of this insurmountable thing that the planet is facing may make things more achievable, but making sure that all departments within a local authority are thinking about that 20-minute neighbourhood. And within that, it comes, so if you go back to the Christie Commission again, if it's local, it comes with risk. Everywhere is going to react differently to things and ask for different things. Some of it won't work. And that's where people like to centralise things, so we don't have a postcode lottery, and we want the same things everywhere else. But that means you undermine a local sense of control. The local control means you have to accept that some things may not be delivered particularly well in some places. But if the community are control, that's just the risk that you have to take. And risk is the thing that we're terrified of, and it's the reason why some communities, and I suppose some of the people I speak to who are not middle management within a local authority, middle management is totally risk averse. They can't have anything that goes wrong, and they can't have anything that a politician will then pick them up on. So they are really risk averse. But frontline local authority workers they want to try things, but they're stymied by middle management. And middle management are stymied for a good reason, because there's pressure on them as well. So there are a range of barriers, but we have to acknowledge that the barriers are there, but still push something that we think might be a policy agenda that could make a difference.
Yeah, great. I was just going to call time on that, but I noticed you put your hand up. I was just going to say, but not only a great presentation, Euan, but also perfect timing, because you just finished us dead on the 4 o'clock, and then Lisa, you come in there, you throw my timing off.
Yeah, sorry, Ryan. Yeah, just with what Ryan's just said, of course, and lots of comments in the chat. Euan, so just to say, lots of comments in chat saying thank you for a great presentation. And I just thought, yes, if we could sneak one more question in, because it's had a few thumbs up from Jamie Smith. Thanks, Euan, for an interesting presentation. Lots of people saying that. It's clear that planning policy has been saying the right things for many years. So what can we do as professionals to support the delivery of these policy objectives into infrastructure on the ground? And Jamie works for a consultancy, Eric, so.
Okay, don't give ground. So I suppose Jamie, when you have clients that want to do something that you know is wrong, you have to tell them. So in my previous job, I had the RIS, RICS, ICE, and the umbrella organisations for the professional bodies all say they want to do the best thing, but their members don't all do the best thing. So we want, because I studied planning, I want to say planning is a good thing. It's not. It's a thing, and people do good and bad things within planning, and it's political. So we make choices. What our clients want. If we know it's bad for the environment or bad for society, how do we push back on that? How do we not work for people that want to do bad things? Which is difficult if you need to earn money. It was a conversation I had a lot with Craig, etc. And I know I was annoying, because I was saying, as long as the professions say, yes, the RTPI want to have a net zero future, meanwhile, members are doing things that are actively damaging that future. And you can still be a planner because it's not breaking your code of conduct. As long as you can be a professional of any of the built environment professions, and the code of conduct is strictly legal, then the professions will continue to kind of reflect the fact that society has a broad range of issues and agendas. So it's for student planners to be thinking about, when they go into work, that they hold strong to the ethical standards of planning, and that for those already in planning, that they are able to talk really directly to their clients about what is the right thing in a global sense to do, to go back to a well-known hackneyed phrase as we think about it, which is difficult, but it comes back to its behaviour change that has to happen, and that will result in better outcomes. And if you are working in private practice, as part of private practice, lobbying for the government probably to be much harsher on what we can and cannot do. We can say there's good practice and say this worked over here and that worked over there, but if you can do something bad quicker and cheaper and make a decent profit, some people are going to do it. And it's providing the legislative framework that means that cannot happen. And you will get the voluntary sector and the community sector lobbying for the stick more. But I suppose within the private sector, having more people within because it's not universal, but having more people within the private sector are up to do great work, lobbying for that sort of thing would be really helpful.
Thanks, Euan. Thanks, Lisa. You did a much better job of coordinating the questions there than I did last time. So thanks for having you on board as well. So that's fantastic. Yeah, cheers, Euan. I think we have a good audience. I think we have people from India, Canada, some of our colleagues internationally. So good to get a broad audience in there. So thanks very much again for your time. And we will make these recordings available on the Urban Institute website. I'll pop the link in. I've not even asked Euan yet if he's okay with me sharing it publicly. Well, so it either will be there or it won't be there. So it's David
Wood that's asking. So I want David to sit at home and watch me